I grew up in a world far removed from the glitz and glamour of city life. Our small weathered house with creaking wooden floors and windows overlooking endless fields was my entire universe. Here, amidst the simplicity and warmth of family love, my dreams were born, painted with the scent of freshly cut grass and the melodies of the wind in old pine trees. My parents, though not wealthy, possessed an immeasurable richness of soul. My father, a local carpenter, had a gift for bringing trees to life, turning them into objects with a soul. His hands, rough from constant work, seemed almost magical as he lovingly perfected every new piece of furniture. He often told me, "Patience, Anna, is the key to everything. It's not just the result that matters, but the process." These words etched themselves into my memory like the patterns carved into his creations. My mother, a schoolteacher, filled our home with books. Their worn pages smelled of dust and mystery, and the words written on them became doors to other worlds. Every night, she would tell me stories woven from her childhood dreams and folk tales that kindled the fire of my imagination. She taught me to find beauty in the little things, the first rays of dawn, the rustle of leaves underfoot, the silence that followed a rainstorm. Life in our small town flowed leisurely, like the old creek running behind our street. Everyone knew each other, and any event, whether it was a fair or the arrival of a new doctor, would be talked about for months. In this simple rhythm, I felt like part of something greater, a link in the endless chain connecting generations. It was in the local library that a new chapter of my life began. There, in the sunlit room with tall windows, among stacks of books and the scent of ink, I first met Mark. He was unlike anyone I had ever known. Tall, with an easy smile that could melt any ice, he came from a world that seemed foreign and distant to me. His family, as I later learned, was well known in town, wealthy, influential, accustomed to luxury and prestige. But Mark was different. His voice, filled with curiosity and gentleness, shattered all stereotypes. He listened to my stories about rural life as if they were precious revelations. Our initial conversations were cautious, like steps on thin ice. He told me about the noise of the city, the endless possibilities, and the dazzling lights. In return, I shared pictures of our life, the harvest festival, quiet walks by the creek, the laughter of neighborhood children on the village square. We started meeting on an old bench by the lake, hidden among tall poplars. There, under the evening sky, our conversations lasted for hours. I remember one day when he said, with a touch of sadness in his voice, "Anna, I feel like I've always lived among people who only care about money and status. But with you, you make me feel something real." His words struck a chord in my heart, melting something inside me that I couldn't put into words. I replied, "Mark, it doesn't matter where we come from. What matters is who we are to each other." He smiled, and in that smile, I saw a promise that our worlds, despite their differences, could unite. The day Mark proposed was as modest as our love. No pomp, no fireworks, just a sincere promise to live together, to share joys and hardships, to support one another. We were sitting on our bench by the lake when he took my hand in his gaze full of hope and tenderness. Mark spoke only a few words, but they went straight to my heart. "Anna, you are my safe harbor. You're everything I could ever dream of." I whispered my agreement, but Mark heard, and in his eyes, I saw a light I'll never forget. That same evening, I was to meet his family. We arrived at their mansion, towering like a solemn monument to a world foreign to me. Every detail, from the wrought iron gates to the gleaming windows, seemed a reminder of how different our lives were. Mark squeezed my hand, as if trying to pass his confidence on to me. "Just be yourself, Anna. That's all that's needed," he said gently. I nodded, hiding my growing anxiety behind a strained smile. The grandeur of the dining room was overwhelming. The walls were adorned with paintings in gilded frames, and the long table, draped in a pristine white cloth, was laden with dishes whose names I didn't even know. At the center of the room stood Mark's mother, Marion, a stately woman with the posture of a queen. Her gaze stopped on me, and a shadow of disapproval flickered across her face before she spoke, her tone dry and slightly condescending. "So, this is the young lady who has captured my son's heart. An interesting choice." Dinner began with formal pleasantries, but every remark from her felt like a calculated jab. Marion handed me a plate with some exquisite dish, smirking slightly. "I suppose this might be too exotic for your taste, Anna. We can offer something simpler if that's more your style." My face flushed, but I maintained my composure. "No, thank you. I'm always happy to try something new," I replied with a smile, hoping it sounded confident enough. However, her words grew sharper, as if testing my limits. She gave my dress, simple but neat, something I thought appropriate for the evening, an appraising look. "Is this what one considers evening attire? It must be challenging to find suitable clothing on a modest budget," she remarked with a faint smirk. Mark tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but his mother was relentless. "Anna, what do your parents do for a living?" she asked, tilting her head with feigned interest. I knew this question was a veiled attempt to find more grounds for criticism. "My father is a carpenter, and my mother is a schoolteacher," I answered, striving to keep my voice steady. "Oh, how interesting," Marion drawled with barely concealed disdain. "I'm sure they are respectable people. Although, I imagine they couldn't provide you with much in terms of opportunities." Every word was a blow to my pride, but I stood my ground. The evening continued under an invisible yet sharp tension. She made sarcastic remarks about my town, my family, even my aspirations. At one point, she began talking about my job, showing an unsettling knowledge of my salary, which made me wonder where she had gotten that information. All of it was delivered with a polite smile, but her words were like thorns, pricking at my pride. Mark's father, Daniel, unlike his wife, was friendly. When dinner was over and Mark and I were preparing to leave, he approached me, smiled warmly, and quietly said, "Anna, you did well. Don't let her get to you. She's like this with everyone. Just give her time." His words were like balm to my soul. When Mark and I got into the car, he immediately apologized. "Anna, I'm so sorry. I didn't think she'd be so harsh," he said, his voice trembling with genuine regret. I looked at him and sighed, barely holding back my emotions. "It's okay, Mark. I knew it wouldn't be easy. But I love you, and that's what matters." That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence of my home. Marion's words echoed in my head, and I felt a pain rise in my chest, mixed with determination. I knew our path wouldn't be easy. But love, after all, isn't always an easy road, is it? The pain from Marion's words didn't leave me, but beneath it, something new began to grow, resolve. It was more than just the desire to fit into someone else's world. It was a test of our love, my strength, and my ability to stay true to myself. I knew that many challenges lay ahead, but I also knew I was ready to face them head-on. As the wedding day drew near, the air was filled with excitement, but also rising tension. Marion took control of the preparations, and her influence was felt at every step. Every idea I had was questioned, every choice I made was judged. One day, sitting with Mark and his mother at the table, we were discussing the details of the upcoming wedding. I had chosen a simple yet elegant dress that, to me, reflected my personality and sense of style. But, of course, Marion had her own opinion. "Anna," she began in a polite yet biting tone, "it's so simple. Don't you want to make a statement on your most important day? After all, you're marrying into a family of a certain status." Mark squeezed my hand under the table, and his supportive gaze was my anchor. "Mom," he replied firmly, "Anna looks beautiful in that dress. It's her choice, and it's perfect." But Marion was unyielding. Oh, Mark, she said, as if explaining something obvious to a child, let's be realistic. This is an important event with people of a certain caliber invited. They expect to see a certain standard. Anna, dear, you should think about something more fitting for our family's status. Her words were like needle pricks, but I didn't allow myself to show hurt. I appreciate your concern, Marion, I replied, maintaining a calm tone, but this dress is special to me. It expresses who I am. Her response was a dismissive wave of the hand. Well, it's your day, I suppose. But don't forget, you represent us too. Her comments became more frequent and sharper. She criticized everything, the floral arrangements, the menu choices, even the design of the invitations. Every remark seemed a subtle reminder of my unsuitability for their family. I tried to hold my ground. Mark and I talked about it late into the night, and I could feel his pain at seeing my struggle. I can't believe she's so difficult, he said, his voice filled with disappointment. I wish she could just see who you really are, and how you make me happy. I lay there, feeling his arms around me, with both love and sadness in my heart. I knew that being Mark's wife meant not only loving him but also learning to navigate this new reality. The wedding day arrived, bright and clear, as if nature itself decided to support us. I wore my simple yet elegant dress, despite Marion's disapproval. My parents helped until the last minute, doing everything they could to make the day perfect. The ceremony was beautiful. Mark looked at me with such love that I felt warmth spread throughout my body. We made our vows, full of sincerity and hope, and for a moment, I forgot about all the hardships. But the reception was ahead, and with it, the inevitable speeches. As I had expected, Marion didn't miss the opportunity to take the microphone. She stood, her stately figure and confident voice attracting everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, she began loudly and clearly, today we have gathered to witness the union of my son Mark and Anna, let's say, someone from a different circle. Her words echoed through the room, and for a moment, everything fell silent. My heart froze. I saw Mark frown, ready to intervene, but Marion continued, Anna grew up in a world far removed from ours. However, Mark has always loved to surprise. And if my son believes this is his happiness, who am I to stand in the way? Her tone was mocking, disguised as approval, and the tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for an explosion. I sat there, gripping my glass of champagne, trying not to reveal my feelings. But somewhere inside, a new determination sparked. This day was about Mark and me, our love, not anyone's expectations or criticism. I knew I wouldn't let a single word ruin what we had built together. A murmur spread among the guests, running like a cold wave through the room. I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if every word from Mark's mother was a sharp point aimed straight at my heart. She continued with her words in a harsh, unyielding tone, leaving no room for doubt about her intentions. While some may praise Mark for his merciful heart, for taking a beggar off the street, we must be cautious, she said, her voice growing louder, as if to make sure no one missed her words. It's important to maintain the reputation and standards of our family at a high level, not letting them be undermined by those who merely seek to elevate their status by clinging to a family of high standing. The words hung in the air, a heavy shroud descending on the room. For a moment, there was complete silence. The guests, Mark's friends and acquaintances from high society, exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. The faces of my parents, sitting at the adjacent table, were twisted in shock and pain. Mark looked as if he had been slapped in the face. His eyes darted from his mother to me, full of disbelief and anger. Something in my chest snapped. Marion's words weren't just insulting. They were a carefully calculated, cold attempt to humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered to us. I felt them like blows, each one tearing my dignity apart. Marion finished her speech with a forced, formal toast to our future. Muted applause followed, as if the guests themselves didn't know whether to support her. The room was filled with awkward silence. Mark stood up. His face burned with suppressed emotion, and his voice trembled slightly. "Anna," he said, addressing me so that the whole room could hear, "I'm sorry. This isn't what I wanted. This isn't how I envisioned this day." His eyes were filled with genuine remorse, but inside, the pain still boiled. I couldn't even look at him. The weight of his mother's words pressed on me like a stone, making it impossible to lift my head. And it was in that moment that something changed. The older woman sitting at the far end of the table slowly rose. It was Mark's grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor, whose name was spoken in the family with respect and reverence. Her calm, confident movement immediately drew everyone's attention. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady but firm. "I want to say something important." All eyes turned to her, and the room fell back into tense silence. "Anna, you have faced criticism today that no one deserves, especially on their wedding day," Mrs. Eleanor continued, her words echoing throughout the hall. I raised my eyes, stunned by her intervention. Mark, sitting next to me, looked just as surprised. But then she turned to Marian. Her voice took on a steely tone that seemed capable of crushing walls. "It seems we've forgotten our past, Marian. Let me remind everyone here, and especially you, that before you became the lady of this house, you were a maid working under this very roof. It was here that you met your husband." The room froze. The air grew heavy with tension. Marian's face turned pale, her eyes wide with shock and embarrassment. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a former maid who rose to the position of the lady of this house, Mrs. Eleanor continued, her voice now booming like thunder, to despise someone for their humble origins and honest means is not just ironic. It is deeply hypocritical. My eyes widened. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. The guests, stunned, sat in silence, hanging on every word. A whisper began to spread across the room as Mrs. Eleanor stood tall, her gaze fixed directly on Marian. "You, who grew up in poverty, should be the last person to demean anyone for their origins. In this family, we value character more than wealth, kindness more than status. Anna has proven to all of us that she has both of these qualities." Marian sat motionless, her face frozen, her lips pressed into a thin line. The entire room was enveloped in a strange sensation, as though a grand storm had just passed through, leaving behind clear skies. Mrs. Eleanor turned to Mark and me, her face softening. "I am proud of both of you. Don't let anyone destroy what you've built together." She raised her glass, and the guests, as if emerging from a trance, hurried to follow her example. This warm support filled me with a new sense of strength. Somewhere deep inside, I understood, while this had been difficult, I was ready to fight for us. Anna embodies these values, and I am proud to welcome her into our family, Mrs. Eleanor concluded her speech, and her voice echoed through the room. Her gaze softened as she looked at me, as if offering her support and confidence. The room erupted in applause, dispelling the tension that had hung in the air. This response was in sharp contrast to the previous muted reaction to Marian's words. Marian sat completely still. Her arrogant expression vanished, replaced by something new, a visible sense of shame. I noticed her hands clenching in her lap, and her gaze dimming. Honestly, I felt no pity for her. Mark leaned towards me and whispered, "I never expected Grandma to stand up for us like that." His voice was filled with astonishment mixed with pride. I squeezed his hand, feeling both relief and gratitude. "She's amazing," I whispered back, looking at Mrs. Eleanor, who had now calmly returned to her seat, leaving Mark and me amidst the buzz of the guests' animated conversations. The rest of the evening passed more easily. The atmosphere lightened, as if the heavy clouds had finally given way to sunlight. Guests approached us with warm congratulations and sincere smiles, their earlier tension seemingly evaporated. For the first time, I felt that they were truly on my side, and the feeling was incredibly comforting. Mark, too, seemed to sense the change. His smile widened, and his gaze grew more peaceful. When we left the reception, hand in hand, I felt a renewed sense of confidence within me. Mrs. Eleanor's words had become the bridge that destroyed Marion's devious plan to humiliate me. Now I knew that Mark and I were standing on solid ground. But the days after the wedding left their mark. Despite the outward joy, an unspoken tension hung in the air within Mark's family. It was like a thick fog that hovered over every conversation, every glance. All of it came to a head during a family meeting organized by Mrs. Eleanor at her house. We gathered in her spacious living room, where the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew this conversation was inevitable. Mrs. Eleanor wasted no time. Her voice was firm, her posture confident, as if she had prepared for this moment in advance. "What happened at the wedding cannot and should not be forgotten," she said, her words directed squarely at Marion. "The way you spoke to Anna was disgraceful." Marion, who usually maintained her composure, seemed somehow smaller, as if her confidence had evaporated under her mother-in-law's piercing gaze. "Eleanor, I've already apologized to Anna," she said, her voice tinged with defiance. "That is not an apology," Mrs. Eleanor countered, her tone cold but not malicious. "Your actions reflect on our entire family. You've become accustomed to a lifestyle funded by the family's money without valuing its true worth." Daniel, Mark's father, nodded in agreement, his expression serious and his voice deep. "My mother is right. You've lost sight of what truly matters." Then Mrs. Eleanor laid out her decision. Every word was carefully measured and left no room for discussion. "I've decided to cut off the financial support you've been receiving. It's time for you to contribute to this family, not just consume its resources. You'll have to find a job and learn to live within your means." Marion's face turned pale. She turned to her husband for support, her voice cracking. "You can't agree with this. She can't just leave me without means." But Daniel was unwavering. "I support my mother in this matter. This time, you've gone too far. It's for your own good." Marion looked at him with anger and disbelief. Her usual composure was crumbling under the weight of this new reality. Mark, who had been silent up to that point, finally spoke. His voice was even, but there was firmness in it. "Mom, Grandma's decision is harsh but fair. You need to understand the consequences of your words and actions. This is a lesson that cannot be ignored." Marion lowered her head. Her shoulders trembled, but she said nothing. The room fell into tense silence once again. It felt as though this moment would be a turning point for all of us. I sat and watched the scene unfold, feeling a mixture of sympathy and relief. Marion sat stiffly in her place, her face pale, her eyes fixed on one point, as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. Mark, holding my hand under the table, silently conveyed his support. His finger gently caressed my palm, and I felt in that touch all the care and loyalty that had always been so evident to me. We both knew that, despite everything on the surface, these few minutes in this room would be hugely significant for the entire family. The meeting ended on a tense note. Mark's mother, shocked by the unexpected turn of events, remained in a state of disbelief. I could see how hard it was for her to accept the reality of her situation. She had obviously been accustomed to living off her family, taking everything for granted, without thinking about the consequences of her actions. Mark and I quietly left the room, and I barely suppressed a chuckle. Not out of malice, but rather because life had finally drawn its line in this endless story. When we crossed the threshold and stepped into the fresh air, Mark leaned toward me and whispered, "I never thought this day would really come. I wish everything had been different, but maybe this is exactly what she needs." His words made my heart beat faster. He was right. Sometimes life forces us out of our comfort zones, makes us look at the world differently, and only then can we begin to change. I nodded, feeling a cautious hope for the future. Maybe this would be the moment from which a new chapter would begin for all of us. For Marian, for her family, for Mark and me. The price had been steep, but necessary. In what had happened, I saw not only punishment but also a chance for change, for correcting mistakes. The honeymoon became a long-awaited escape for Mark and me from the family storms. We strolled along sandy beaches, and each step felt like a liberation from all the stress we had experienced over the past weeks. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore soothed me, like caring hands ready to protect me from all harm. In the evenings, when the sun was setting, we sat hand in hand, watching the horizon. "Hold me," Mark whispered one evening, his voice soft, full of longing. "I'm sorry that our wedding turned into such a drama, Anna. I wish everything had been different." I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace, his genuine concern. "It's okay, Mark," I whispered, feeling his breath calm me. "It's not your fault. What matters now is that we're together. Far away from all of this." He sighed, looking at the ocean, his gaze thoughtful. "Yes, but when we get back, we'll have to face reality. The situation with my mom, it will be hard for her." I nodded, understanding his concern. This was indeed a moment that would force her to face the inevitable. But I believed that maybe this would be her chance to grow, to change her views, to see things from a different perspective. Perhaps she needed to experience this pain to truly understand the weight of the words she had spoken. The days spent in this corner of the world became not just a rest but a time for reflection, for strengthening our bond. We talked a lot about the future, about the difficulties that might await us. But the strange sense of mutual understanding that we shared kept strengthening us. We would overcome everything, I was sure of it. Whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger. On the last night of our honeymoon, when we were packing our bags, Mark looked particularly thoughtful. Suddenly, he turned to me and said, "You know, Anna, everything that's happened has made me realize how much you mean to me. I can't imagine living my life with anyone else." I smiled, touched by his words. They meant more to me than anything he had said before. "I feel the same, Mark. We've been through so much, but it's only strengthened our relationship. We can handle whatever comes our way, as long as we're together." When we drove back home, I felt a strange sense of peace. The honeymoon had been not only a break from the chaos, but also a time to prepare for the new chapter in our lives. We were returning to a changed reality, but now, with this newfound strength and confidence, we were ready to face whatever awaited us. We were together, stronger and more united than ever. The drive was quiet, and I felt my gaze shift from the outside world to the inner one, to Mark, with whom we were now standing at the threshold of a new chapter. We didn't know exactly what awaited us in his family home, but at least now we were ready for change. When we arrived, the first thing we noticed was the absence of Mark's mother. There was no loud presence, no familiar figure filling every corner of the house, no endless chatter and shouting. This empty house seemed the same as always, but at the same time, completely different. Inside, we were greeted by his grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor. She wore the same genuine, unhurried smile that hid no pretense. She opened the door and, smiling, said, "Welcome back, you two. I imagine you're wondering about the changes here." Her words, spoken lightly but with an undertone of seriousness, immediately raised my alert. I felt that something had happened, and it certainly couldn't be good. "Yes, where's Mom?" Mark asked, scanning the space as if hoping to find her in a corner, but she was nowhere to be seen. He looked around, clearly confused. Mrs. Eleanor took a deep breath and, still smiling, slightly tilted her head. Her face bore the wisdom and weariness that had long been part of her character, like constant companions. "After you left, Marian made quite a scene. She demanded that I restore her financial support. When I refused, she decided to leave. Now she's living in a small apartment and, from what I've heard, is looking for a job. These words hung in the air, and like a heavy stone, they dropped onto my chest. Mark and I exchanged glances. The news was sinking in, and it took me a few seconds to process that this was really happening. It was a sharp turn, like the breaking of a vicious cycle. Mark's mother, accustomed to a life of luxury, was now forced to look for work and live in a cramped apartment. The contrast was overwhelming. But that's not all, Mrs. Eleanor continued, her voice lowering as if she were sharing something especially important with us. Your father is thinking about divorce. He's tired of her antics. It seemed she finally pushed him too far. But, honestly, she brought it all upon herself. Mark, his face reflecting shock and confusion, struggled to swallow. I could see how his gaze deepened, and for a few seconds, he seemed lost in his thoughts. Of course, he knew that his parents' relationship wasn't perfect, but for it to come to the point where even his father was considering ending everything was too much for him. I can't believe this, Mark whispered. I knew things would change, but this is much more than I expected. I reached out and touched his hand. I needed to convey my support, to feel that we were together despite everything happening around us. This is a lot to take in, I said. But maybe this is the best chance for everyone to start over, on a more honest foundation. We both felt the weight of the words Mrs. Eleanor had said sinking into our souls, but at the same time, there was something liberating about it. It was a chance for everyone, not just for Mark's mother, but for the whole family. Dinner that evening went surprisingly peacefully. We sat at the table, and of course, the absence of Mark's mother was felt, but not as much as we had expected. The atmosphere was much calmer and more open. All conversations were genuine, without forced smiles or hollow words. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that we were really communicating as a family. Perhaps with this new beginning, we could learn to be honest with each other. As we drove home late that evening, Mark sat silent, lost in thought, his eyes absorbed in thoughts that clearly wouldn't leave him. I always hoped for change, he finally said, his voice deep and full of contemplation. But I didn't expect everything to happen like this. This will be a huge change for Mom. I nodded, understanding how hard this was for him. It truly was a difficult situation, and it was painful for each of us. But at some point, I realized that it might be a necessary step for everyone. It's tough, I said, but maybe it's what she needs to grow. And for your dad, to find peace. The road home was quiet, and the night enveloped us with its dark, almost magical embrace. We were returning to the family we had left, leaving behind the old dynamics, old habits, and resentments. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were returning to something new. The honeymoon was no longer what we thought it would be. We were no longer the people who had left. It was a sobering realization, but also one that gave hope. Change, although sometimes painful, often leads to something better. And now, as we returned to reality, we were ready to face whatever awaited us, but with the confidence that we would face it together.